So hi everybody, thanks for joining us today, and of course thanks to the local folk for having me in the first place. It's a great privilege to be here, and I'm sure it's the beginning of a wonderful friendship, as the saying goes. I will try to make this barrage as succinct and brief as possible. What I basically want to point out at the outset is that the notion of esotericism is widely employed across different fields and disciplines. For instance, within the context of Buddhism, late antiquity, Hinduism, Islam, and so-called Western esotericism. Yet research on these various subjects is remarkably disconnected, so these people don't really talk to each other. And this is one of the major challenges that we are dealing with at the moment. In what follows, I will offer some historical explanations of why esoteric, this notion, this vocabulary is so widespread, but more importantly, or more centrally, I will propose the approach of global religious history as one way to facilitate collaborative research on esotericism, whatever it may mean, across regional and chronological boundaries. I will do that by first pointing out at least some of the problems with the notion of, or the concept of, Western esotericism. I will demonstrate these issues in light first of theosophy in India extremely briefly, and second, in light of the language, the vocabulary of esoteric as a historically used comparative category. And I will refer mainly to publications that are out there that I've published, just to show that I'm not making things up and I'm making strong arguments. So I just want to show that there is something to back them up with. I want to then conclude by addressing this issue of esotericism in Asia, highlighting some challenges, and then making one proposal, namely that of global religious history. At the very outset, I think it is absolutely crucial to make very explicit a distinction between two aspects. First, Western esotericism as a historical object of study, and second, Western esotericism as a research paradigm and the demarcation of a field of study. With respect to the first one, it is a matter of fact that this notion, Western esotericism, emerged towards the end of the 19th century. It's out there. It emerged within a polemical discourse, and I've written a whole book on that, but that's in German, so I have a bunch of English articles out of that. This one is most directly related to this point here. You might check it out. I upload all this stuff on Academia Edu. I hope Bill isn't listening, but I do that. And the crucial point is that this notion, Western esotericism, is as much a contingent historical reality as the West, national religious identities, etc. And as such, it can and should be studied. And this is something to point out very, very centrally and very prominently, because this often gets lost in debate. I do not argue for the abolishment of Western esotericism as a historical object of study, and nor do I argue that scholars should not attempt to employ the category esotericism analytically to study pre-19th century sources or sources beyond Western Europe. So my argument is not, oh, this emerged at the end of the 19th century, esotericism, nobody must do anything but that. It's not at all what I'm saying. Rather, I argue that scholars have tended to accept uncritically a polemical construct and project it anachronistically and in decontextualized ways to reaffirm a tradition of Western esotericism or a Western esoteric tradition, most often implicitly. So the vast majority of scholars do not have the intention of proclaiming a Western esoteric tradition, but they implicitly do so by reproducing this narrative. And this leads me to the second aspect, namely Western esotericism as a research paradigm and the demarcation of a field of study, which I argue leads to a narrow focus on the sources, is based on a historically flawed and tendentiously amic narrative about rejected knowledge in Western culture, and it has the tendency to self-marginalize the field. I understand these are pretty strong claims, but there's a whole volume out there where different authors are making similar arguments. I make that argument, of course, you're all very much welcome to have a closer look at that. Here, I want to concretely point out or argue that the use of this paradigm tendentiously excludes or sidelines historical actors and their sources, obviously, that we can access by focusing on the activities of specific Westerners. So not only just Westerners in general, whatever that means, but even specific Westerners. And I will show that very briefly in light of example 1. Or it distorts approaches to source material because of a preconceived corpus. And I showed it in light of example 2. So scholars look for something that they already have preconceived as being part of Western esotericism and neglect everything else. So again, Western esotericism can and should be studied as a historical subject. However, it emerged in a concrete historical context as a polemical identity marker based on a supposed Western esoteric tradition or corpus, which has been reproduced in scholarship. And I would say that there is now a very large pile of arguments to show that this concept is analytic, as an analytical category is flawed, at least. There needs to be a discussion about that. And I would also argue that its pragmatic value, which is often stressed, is at least questionable because, you know, the West thing, and it doesn't make things easier. I think if anything has become clear in these debates, it's that. And then, of course, the field's relationship to other fields and disciplines is certainly not facilitated by this insistence on a Western esoteric corpus or tradition or Western esotericism or whatever. I've pointed at the variety of criticisms in this new approach as well. So just to point out where this paradigm can lead to, there is this very diffusionist perspective to the Theosophical Society that many of you will know, so I will allow myself not to introduce it largely, like extensively, but it emerged in 1875, was established then, it relocated very quickly to India, became a major political cultural force in India. And so far it has been investigated mainly as an export, so to speak, of Western esotericism to India, to which then Indians reacted. So it's a very diffusionist, very Eurocentric narrative that focuses exclusively on Western esotericists, theosophists, or well, maybe esotericists in general, and it completely neglects local context and the agency of Indian actors. Again, I would like to just point you to 2 publications. I have uploaded the Introduction to Global Tantra to Academia Edu, and this Theosophy, Race, and the Study of Esotericism article is open access, so you can just Google it and get it. Example 2 is something that is forthcoming, and I went back to actually the 16th century, but especially the 17th and 18th centuries, and I tried to show that the language of esoteric, and we're talking about world fields here, of course, like esotericus, occultus, etc., proliferated in Orientalist, missionary, etc. writings since the 17th century, and it was firmly established by the 18th. So like Orientalist scholarship, missionary writings, they abound with this vocabulary to describe mostly things Eastern. They talk about the Kabbalah of the Sufis. They talk about the esoteric teachings of this and that, the Brahmins, of course, very prominently, the Persians. I can just point at this at the moment, but I would like to make, to just highlight that there is a reason why this language is so omnipresent in scholarship up to the present day, in Asianist scholarship, in Indological scholarship, in Buddhological scholarship. People have been using this language for centuries, and this is a gross simplification, to discuss these kinds of subjects. So I'm not suggesting that there is some kind of Eastern occultism or esotericism that has always been discussed in these terms or anything like that. What I try to show is that there are these comparative categories that have been employed as a matter of fact, and we must now understand why and how. So what we can observe then, that's the other big argument I tried to establish, is that this delineation of a Western esoteric corpus is actually happening on the basis of sources that extensively and sometimes predominantly discuss quote-unquote Eastern subjects. So You have the work of Monika Neugebauer-Wölk, for instance, Wouter Hannegraaff, who completely correctly say, yeah, this and this page discusses Rosicrucians and Theosophists in the sense of Böhme and so on, and Paracelsians. But if you then continue a bit, then you have 50 pages about Brahmins and yogis and Sufis and so on. So it is not completely wrong to just say, oh, well, there's a Western esoteric subject going on there, but it is extremely incomplete. Like, it's a very narrow look at the sources that is based on this end of the 19th century polemical concept. Like, that is at the root of this lens, this analytical lens. And on top of that, if you then look at who those people were who wrote these sources, then yes, of course, yeah, many were Freemasons. Most people in those positions were Freemasons at the time in the 18th century. But they were also like Orientalists, like they occupied chairs for Orientalist studies. For instance, Johann Gottfried Eichhorn in Göttingen, or Jacques Matthieu in Strasbourg. Matthieu being specifically known to scholars of esotericism because he was the first to coin esoterism in French, and Eichhorn was one of the first to talk about like the esoterica, and so on. Okay, so if we now take this to the context that most of you are much more familiar with, and I have to stress that this is not my turf at all. Like, I do research on Indian things, and I tried my best to get a grasp, like superficial grasp of the esoteric Buddhism scholarship, and please take me apart for this. I just try to make this point, and I'm interested in what you make of that. So there is this issue of esoteric Buddhism, which, as you know, can mean very different things, but is very often related to Mikyo. This notion either is used, and we have seen that in Hansan's paper very well, is either used to discuss post-World War II developments, where it is related to Mikyo, the Okaruto, like the occult boom in the 1970s and so on, but much more prominently, and like in terms of fields of study, like much more extensively, it is used to discuss subjects that reach back to the 6th century, to the 10th century, that are at the core of Buddhological scholarship. So we are dealing, for instance, with an issue of translation here. And I found it striking that this translation issue, like, why are those things called esoteric? Like, why esoteric Buddhism? I found it extremely striking that this is discussed mostly in passing. Of course, these are experts who discuss the source material in depth. They describe dharani, they describe rituals, they describe all these kinds of things, and explain why they think it's reasonable to subsume that under the category of esotericism. But I have not found a very in-depth discussion of why esoteric Buddhism, like why exactly. And often you have this remark, oh yeah, there's this issue that Alfred Percy Sinnett, a prominent theosophist, used this explicit notion, like this exact notion, esoteric Buddhism, probably for the first time, which is not, I would say, the most interesting point about this, since I have found no extensive discussion of the fact that this older Orientalist scholarship also, and much earlier, uses this kind of language. Like, there are these esoteric people in Asia doing stuff. Yeah. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is referring to one thing, like to one Asian esotericism or one esoteric Buddhism or so. We just have the matter of fact that sources use this signifier, esoteric, to discuss stuff. And in scholarship, what is most often highlighted is the aspect of secrecy, of initiation, Abhisheka, and of course that is also mirrored by Indian Tantrism, which I'm much more familiar with, where you have Diksha in initiation, and so these teachings are Gurya or Guru in Bengali. They're secret, but at the same time, and this is something that is stressed by all experts basically, we have the fact that these secret initiatory things are omnipresent They are even predominant. They are very popular. They are part of elite discourses. They are part at the core of institutions. They are at the foundation of major practices, mandalas, yantras, temple constructions, mantra, japa, all these kind of things that is foundational to all of that. And if you open this wonderful handbook on esoteric Buddhism and Tantrism in East Asia. Sorry, probably I'm mingling the title a bit here. The very first sentence in this massive volume is, in all likelihood, it was what Buddhism scholars commonly designate esoteric Buddhism that had the greatest geographical spread of any form of Buddhism. So you have a tension there. And this is something that can certainly be fruitfully discussed. And one thing that bears highlighting is that all this does not map at all on this concept of rejected knowledge that, at least in one major understanding of esotericism, is absolutely foundational. And I agree to the criticism that this focusing on rejected knowledge as the definition of esotericism does also not work in the so-called West. But that is another argument. Again, I would like to point you to Egil Asprim's article on that in the New Approaches volume. What we can be certain of, however, and this goes for all these kinds of different subjects, is that we're talking about something highly polemical, like people always claimed whatever it is, you know, as a superior, it's secret, you know, like it's guru, it's guhya, because we are the true tradition, the true school, the true lineage. And you know the argument about Mahayana or esoteric Buddhism basically being an integral part of Mahayana Buddhism, employed by representatives who say, well, we are the best and the purest and so on. So this is always there. We have claims to authority and superiority. And of course, most generally, we are always talking about the formation of identities, the construction of lineages, and so on. You know, all these kinds of buzzwords that come to mind, invention of tradition, and so on. So I would say that there are two levels that would warrant collaborative research to tackle all this. And this is first the issue of translation. I'm personally a big fan of Lydia Liu's translingual practice, which emphasizes very strongly the need for historical contextualization. And then we have the level of social dynamics and practices, where we have things like initiation, secrecy, but also, for instance, ritual, all very tricky issues. Are tricky indeed. So what is my proposal? It's one proposal. I want to stress that very strongly. I'm not preaching the great revelation or the solution to anything, but I would start with the fact that this global religious history approach can be useful because there is a common ground. Like in all these struggles, there was no esoteric tradition. Like even those who I argue would implicitly repudiate the claim of that there is actually one, would say, no, of course I don't want to say that. So that is quite clear. You know, we are not talking about one thing. We are not talking about a universal esotericism that manifests in different places, or about one esoteric Buddhism or whatever. What we can say for sure is that constructions of Western esotericism, to return to that point, were conditioned and structured within a global context, and explicitly refer to other, especially Asian traditions, groups, practices, relating signifiers such as Kabbalah and yoga, and using the language of esoteric and occult. That can be studied. We can do that. We can look at how the sources, like how we can make sense of the sources doing that. And if we really want to take the focus on an anti-essentialist historiography seriously, which is an insistence that is often made, and we see esotericism as an umbrella term that is not one essential thing, then we must acknowledge that esotericism has never been limited to the West, because all the sources that we usually hear about, they simply don't do that. Now, of course, this mirrors all these big problems in religious studies, which is my field, my discipline. What is religion, right? Many of you will know the big problem that is. And of course, the historical context directly relates to global history. So I'm a big advocate of making the best of these two disciplines. Again, I would point you to the introduction of my recent book. Giovanni Maltese, my good friend, and I have co-edited a special issue. The intro there is actually open access as well. There are great contributions to that special issue, so you can read up on what we make of that. Crucially, the historiographical point of departure is the fact that today esotericism and religion are globally used. That is just a fact. Now we can ask the question, how did that happen? Another fact is that their meaning was constantly renegotiated through global exchanges in which non-Western, quote unquote, big quote unquote, actors played a significant role, and their context must be investigated in their own right, not as like influences or like some sidelines or whatever. And crucial to that is that what most people today, like at least pay lip service to, yeah, we have to reflect on our positionality, we have to do historical contextualization, and we should avoid essentialized ideas. So to address more like you, ladies and gentlemen here more directly, it does seem important to me to not only facilitate a discussion between the study of esotericism based on the Western esotericism paradigm, but also to facilitate discussions between experts concentrating on different regions, and as well as experts focusing on various periods within one region. It's just like, for instance, the occult boom thing versus esoteric Buddhism in the 10th century. And the framework of such a collaboration could benefit from global historical perspectives, including the approach proposed here. And I hope that made some sense. I apologize for the additional time, and I thank you for your attention.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you for this very exciting presentation, and I've read all of your work, so I was very excited to have this summary again to remind me of a lot of the very fascinating ways of actually approaching this a problem that we have had, and I want to start with this. We have had these issues in a sense from the start. So back in 2015, when Professor Yoshinaga was starting thinking about making a network, which originally was called the Japanese Network for the Academic Study of Esotericism, the idea had been, and I think he had told me that it was kind of recommended to him by ESSWE to do this in order to kind of make, meet new people, spread the word of what it was happening already in Japan to people who would have common vocabulary. And I think it was for him very much a problem of common vocabulary, that the things that he was doing here. I mean, I think also when he was going abroad, he found more people more interested in what he was doing here than perhaps people here. That was another issue. But I think that was he wasn't much. He didn't have a particular solution to, I think, to what to do with esotericism, as Orion mentioned before. He was still kind of thinking about the terms, but he was very much interested in using the word to actually meet people who had some kind of common language. And I think that was the idea behind, and it still is the idea behind, when he suggested that we change from Japanese to East Asian so that we involve more people from other areas of Asia. We had a question about esotericism, I think, at the panel. We had a question about, is there an East Asian esotericism at the conference that we did last year by Jason Josephson. Also mentioned, aren't you creating an East Asian esotericism with this? So if there's no Western esotericism, aren't we, by calling something East Asian or Japanese, aren't we just creating that from this ground up, if you want? So we have been, and I think Hansen very nicely summarized these issues from the start of her paper, that we have been handling these issues of nomenclature from the beginning. So I wanted to talk a bit about only one idea of how to, because my problem has always been a bit these words, and how to perhaps avoid it, one solution to avoid them, or maybe not the best. I'm not coming from a religious studies or history. I'm more about contemporary stuff and area studies. So the research that I've been reading and I'm mostly enjoying from esotericism is research that really kind of illustrates how esotericism is constructed with other things, right? Like socialism and occultism and things like that. So and what I try to look into this, and especially in the contemporary period, when I look at my subject and people that I interview and stuff, I always figured out that there is something that they want to do. So it's not about the words, but using those words, what does it allow them to do, and what does it allow them to kind of claim? And something that is commonly seen, I think, it's these ideas about alternatives. My stuff is better or is different from what other people do, right? So I thought, what if we forget, for instance, all these concepts and spirituality and etc., and we focus on these claims of alternativity, or we could go with I think you used the polemical rhetorics. And there is, of course, the problem that also that if we try to make also justice to what people claiming that they they have their own politics, and we cannot ignore them in our studies, especially if we do ethnography, it's particularly important to do that. Then when you come into the scholarly fields and try to use those same words, then there is also all the kinds of issues that I think we mentioned briefly before about, okay, but are they using that word, and what do we use, and all these things. So what if we talk about why they use those words and the alternative? And I wanted to focus on two problems I think we have had, particularly at least in areas that I'm interested in, but I think it's something that is, I think, as you mentioned, perhaps in general in religious studies. The use of visibility to argue for relevance, and I think that has been booms, right? And media trends and things like that. I think that it's something that seems to be taken up by scholars as a kind of a sign of, this is relative, this is significant, and they also are used to compare things. So, okay, we didn't have a New Age here; we have a Seishin Sekai, or how they called it. Now, but they're similar. Okay, let's compare them, and they're both kind of based on, for example, books or publications, or category of bookshops and things like that. So there was this idea, this problem of how to account for visibility, and how much of visibility is really a sign of significance. And I think a lot of some scholars of religion, at least in Japan, dislike this concept of boom, because it's very much something that is okay. This is something happening right now. It's not only media related. Boom in Japan is used for many things, right? For environmental kind of ideologies, for anything can be a boom. But it has this, and I have a quote that I think later on Erika Baffelli has talked about this briefly in her book on media and new religions in Japan, about this problem of using boom to explain phenomena which are actually based on something that is emphasis the here and now, instead of, okay, but why have we come to actually think of this as a boom? So there is issues of visibility and how we use them to argue for relevance and comparativeness. And the other problem is how some of these visible kind of versions of the things that we study sometimes are explained as lesser expressions of better versions that are not visible, but only scholars know of them, something like that. And I think here a lot of this has also to do with not only studies of esotericism, but things that have been happening in studies of spirituality. And for example, so there is I think a collapse of what we describe and how people describe it, and it becomes like spirituality is, and we say what people say, but without analyzing that particular saying, we then go on and say it because Japanese religion in general is like this. And I'll give an example in a moment. So eventually we come at some point, I think, when these descriptives are then changed into empty reference, and we can say, yeah, in this case it means this, but in other cases it means that, and then we can avoid thinking about the term. And I think spirituality has come also in some sense, it has reached that point where we don't have to define it in general, but then if we define it in a specific case, we can defend ourselves because well, I mean, my informants use it, and then that's how far we go. And I think there is a problem there where how we use descriptives to both talk about what people say and also analyze what they say. And I came about this because it was because I'm coming from Japanese studies, and I'm always kind of it has its own politics as a field, problems, area studies in general. So there was this particular commonality between how people have in the 80s, 90s, even before that, have talked about religion in Japan, and how other people have used the same kind of descriptions to talk about New Age, for example. So we have had these issues of what is, these spots of standard. So Japanese religion is all about bricolage and eclecticism and natural religion and utilitarianism and nonchalant consumption, right? But also it's the same thing that people say it's New Age has been about, right? And I always thought that, okay, there is these big problems here about these standards of comparison and what do we compare, and of course this kind of blurry West and the constant comparison between, okay, this is in Japan and the rest is usually it's the United States or the UK maybe, but so this kind of for building a formativeness, building what is Japanese in order to make a comparison with something that it keeps becoming more blurry and blurry with the years. So one solution I thought was, okay, let's forget what the script is perhaps, or at least put them at the background and look at what are these some of these agents. And I think Egil Asprem he talks about agency, right? And how much it's important to actually look at agency in and why do people actually claim that they're esoteric or etc. And what this alternativeness kind of what are these goals, and are they really different from what people say it's mainstream? Often it's not the case, and what is in practice, what does it mean for them to use this in their daily lives, for example, and what is considered alternative, of course, in which context, but that comes at the end. And I wanted to give an example. So spirituality in Japan, it's something that has also been constantly explained against booms. So there was a spiritual boom in the right in the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, and visibly it was a boom because you can look for the word and find that there's so many articles and newspapers and books about it, and there are then at the same time around 2007 you have journalists talking about why there is a boom, kind of. So they kind of there's a looping effect, right? So they reinforce each other in a sense. And then you have also surveys, right? We constantly use, it's another ways of making things visible are surveys that say, you know, all that people say that they believe in UFOs, therefore there is people are more, there's more and more people who are believe in spirituality and things like that. And I think that has also happened in outside of Japan as well. But it always comes to, of course, surveys are always very problematic, but it always comes down to, okay, but why is believing in the afterlife in Japan a sign of spirituality and not a sign of something else? What does it make this particular, you know? So we are in a boom, and we try to argue that there is a spiritual boom using same data than 30 years earlier. They would kind of, you know, mean something else. And the problem, of course, constantly is about the fact that in the end, of course, surveys don't mean much. I mean, this one on the left, 70% replied that actually they're not interested in 75% or something in spirituality, but the survey still had to explain what spirituality is, which kind of goes against the objective of the survey. But also the same survey found that 26% of the respondents claim to also believe in something religious, but it doesn't say if it's the same who also replied that they like the spiritual. So in the end, okay, so what does this mean? So I don't want to go into very much detail, but I think we know already that visibility doesn't really mean social influence and relativeness and vitality. I think that's something important. But if it's not visibility that we can use to actually claim for these new or alternative and developments, what can we do? And I thought this one in the book that is coming up in November, I thought that one way was going to actually try to see how people have used, in my case, spirituality to claim for an alternative. But this alternative depends very much, of course, on the people who use it. For example, scholars in Japan have used the spirituality as a concept to claim for a particular alternative to the role of religion, but it's the same kind of goal that they have. I think many of these scholars involved in the studies of spirituality, which is the idea that religion needs for them to play a function of bond-forming power that can save us from disasters, whether natural or social. And I think a way to talk about spirituality, in a sense, is just to find out why particular people want to talk and approach the subject and talk so much about it. And that would be this, you know, for the scholars, I think it was an alternative for religion. Okay, if we can't use the word of religion, maybe spirituality can reach the same kind of goals. The second, and I use the media aspect, I think is also very important, but then in media, of course, is also something else. And I think in the media, spirituality is more used in terms of something that instead of religion. So, okay, don't go in there. This is something else. Pay more attention to yourself and self-cultivation and self-development. And of course, there is a very much, we have to put this in context within psychological practices that have been very popular in Japan, especially Rogers psychotherapy, etc. So there is a whole background to this, but this is yet another kind of alternative. Why in the media spirituality has been so much in vogue in those years. And then, of course, we have to look at the people who use spirituality to describe their own business and the things that they do, the therapies. And in here, I think I think also the context works very much, because we need to think about precarity and exclusion and the economic developments of from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and how alternative ideas of alternative worldviews and lifestyles kind of inform this you know, imaginaries of alternativity and what spirituality can offer us. So this was kind of my one way, right? So if we don't look at the words and look at what people try to attain or achieve through the use of those words, what can we say? But for the different people who are involved, because everyone obviously doesn't use these words in the same way. So going back to formativeness, and I think this is something that we're gonna come back up in here, is this idea about, you know, is it still a thing? I mean, when we try, when you know, because I had to read about the New Age, and when I read about the New Age movement and in the way some people have talked about it, it's basically a category of books, right? And books that have been put together in a book, in an analysis, if you want, and so it's in a sense a kind of scholar creating a format. And so look at these, they all have kind of the same messages, they're part of the same category. So here it is, this is New Age religion, for example, right? So, and I thought that, so is formativeness still a thing to worry about? And what are the methods? I think one method that you already presented is kind of tries to go against looking into how formative things are, but looking at how the genealogy of why and how they're used. And so that would be my kind of input. Thanks for
first shot.
Luis, yeah.
Well, I do have a question for Julian. Actually, would you go as far as to say that the future of esotericism lies in global studies, like in global history, or like global studies more general, like going beyond methodological nationalism?
I find that statement a bit too categorical. I wouldn't put it like that. If somebody wants to do Flemish 15th century paintings and rosy proof nuts, like alchemical motifs or anything like that, of course, that should be entirely possible within the study of esotericism. So what I'm saying is not that everybody should do global approaches or anything like that. I would argue for two things. I would say that the paradigm of Western esotericism as it's predominantly used is generally or can generally be misleading. Also when we discuss European sources, for instance. And the other thing that I'm saying is that a broader understanding of what esotericism could mean historically, different meanings, of course, always, can be more comprehensively approached if you take into account that there are entanglements with other regions, with other languages across large distances, also preceding the 19th century. So global approaches can be very helpful, but they are certainly not the only way to tackle these things. And again, a clear parallel can be drawn to religion, like this big debate. Of course, nobody who does research on religion should be required or bullied into doing something global. But the debates that we're having, especially when it comes to Western esotericism, actually requires that kind of perspective, because if you come up with the Western, then you come up with a geographical demarcation. And in that case, you do have to deal with the fact that there are arguments against that.
Right. Yeah. Luis, okay. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Good. So, oh, yeah. I don't know if it goes that far, but yeah, go on. Okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the term source. Professor Julian as well as me used the term esoteric Buddhism as an interpretation of the Japanese term Mikkyo. But Also, tantric Buddhism is also a synonym to esoteric Buddhism, and as far as I know, tantric Buddhism or Tantra Buddhism was generally used in Western society after a post-war period, in post-war period. So is there any difference in nuance between esoteric Buddhism and tantric Buddhism? So, and is the term tantric Buddhism also usually used in Western academy these days?
Well, first, again, the disclaimer that I'm out of my depth when it comes to East Asian material, but of course I can talk about the subject of Tantra. And what I do know is that there are very different understandings of esoteric Buddhism in scholarship. Some would argue, well, it's basically just a variety of Mahayana polemics, basically. Others would say, well, it's a combination of tantric elements and Buddhist elements. Others would say, well, actually, we should only talk about tantric Buddhism because that's the only way that could reasonably be described as esoteric. Those are different arguments, right? I'm not taking sides in that because I'm not an expert, but I can address the Tantra question that you raise because that is, of course, a very prominent Indian subject as well and immediately related. There is basically a common agreement that there is no one thing that could reasonably be like singled out as a monolithic block being Tantra. There are the Tantras. There are very different ways or different contents of these writings. There are very different self-ascriptions and practices and writings that are related to these. And then, of course, you have more recent polemics about what the Tantras are and what they are not are, what Tantra and Tantrism is since the 19th century, a symptom of degeneration, for instance, of the pure Vedic grammatical Buddhism, that's Hinduism, big quotations marks, or the esoteric core of true Vedic grammatical tradition, Sanatana Dharma, like this whole debate in the 19th century. So again, and this is actually leading also to the terminology question, my argument would be to acknowledge that there is this terminology around historically, and we should understand how that came to be, right? And of course, it designated something. It wasn't just made up by Orientalists, such as, for instance, Hinduism wasn't just made up by Orientalists. That designation happens, however, in a specific historical context. And our job as historians, I would argue, say, to unravel how that designation came to be, right? And then, of course, we have scriptures called the Tantras. We have people referring at some point to themselves as Tantric. Why do they do that? How do they do that? In what context do they do that? What do they argue about? Like, that's the way I would approach it, but there are, of course, others.
Thank you very much.
Right. Shall we? Oh, we can't see anyone, right? Reacting.
Oh, yes, you're reacting.
Nice. I want to ask, was there, about the debates on Western, do we need Western or not?
Yeah, maybe a little bit louder.
Okay, in the debates about, I think we have a question.
Do we? Oh, yeah. Esther Elena Blavatsky talks about the Yamabushi sect in Japan. Do you know anything about that or its significance in light of the subject?
Well, I mean, I think most of us know that there was a book even, Occult Japan, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the 19th century, that was very much a fascination with the mountain asceticism, right? But I don't know about within Helena Blavatsky's.
Well, I know the reference, but I like Japan is not my thing. You know, like I wouldn't be the candidate to give an informed answer to that.
I don't know how she talks about it, but we can say a lot of things about how the Yamabushian were a subject of fascination of many of the Orientalists, I guess, right in the late 19th century, and even after that. There was a Caleb Carter, right? Caleb Carter has written a fascinating book about this on Shugendo and how it changed using a particular location, but I think he makes new arguments about the development of Shugendo and Yamabushi. So I would recommend to read that. Yeah, maybe you can, you know him. Caleb Carter, it's a book. It's
Caleb Carter.
Caleb, yeah. It just came out at the University of Hawaii Press. So I would recommend that, yes. But I was going to ask, so when the debates about Western came up, what was, there wasn't any debate about how far, I mean, there was a baby, how far the West goes. Because I know that a lot of the, you know, there's a lot of research about Russian esotericism in Russia, right? Already before the whole debate. So was there any kind of typically perhaps European debate about how far Europe goes and
of course,
within, because we're not really part of these debates, but
what
there was,
like, of course. I mean, this like, I think one of the most instructive, or one of the examples that is most instructive of how blurry and I would say unhelpful this category is as an analytical lens, right? Like as a demarcation for a field of study, is that even in the European context, like what is East and West? Like, I'm from Germany. For me, Eastern Europe starts in the middle of Germany.
Right.
I'm making
yes.
These categories are extremely historically contingent. Like the East, like there are actually recent arguments. Who's the famous foreign policy analyst from the United States, like top tier, who had in Foreign Affairs an article just 10 years ago or so, arguing that Germany was never part of the West. And this debate now resurfaces because of the ties to Russia that led to a certain precarious situation at the moment. And my point is that even within Europe, it's completely unclear how to draw these boundaries. There's a very great article by Mariano Villalba in our New Approaches volume that also sheds light on South America. Also in the Americas that are not the United States and Canada, people would say, yeah, of course we're part of the West, right? It's like why were we written out of the story of the West? So that is always contested. There are some who argue that, oh, the West ends in Persia or close to India and South Asia. I don't think that like this category just brings in so many problems that could be so easily.
Because when scholars make comparisons between West and Japan, for example, they often have this tendency of, I mean, the West is very much, everyone knows what it is about, but no one really talks about it. But some of the material, and I think it has to do with your point about translation, some of the material that they rely on are translations, right, or books. I mean, typically in spirituality, the popularity of New Age books is a sign of of how popular New Age is also in Japan, for example. It used to be, at least. But those which are called New Age books are mostly American books. But then even in there, I mean, what is American New Age, right? I mean, there's so much in there already that, okay, when does this, this comparativeness stop? And what do you compare? Because even in the process of translation, a lot of this also is omitted, right? a lot of translations into Japanese omit a lot of the background chapters, for example. You have second and third versions of classic New Age, let's say, material that actually are trimmed down to appeal to a Japanese public. So there's a lot of involved in
yeah, and of course you can't think the New Age without the spiritual East,
right.
You know, like, and that whole notion is historically very complex. It's not simply a Western projection. It was taken out and appropriated very aggressively by Asian intellectuals, in Canada, for instance, the whole Pan-Asianist movement that uses that Orientalist cliche and turns it on its head and actually charges it against the materialist, degenerate West that is, you know, in decay because they're only interested in money and you know, that kind of thing. So again, like the New Age has a global history, right? It's unthinkable to look at the New Age and only focus on Europe or North America. And perhaps that's I mean, because you address this problem of terminology, right? And that is, of course, one of the most crucial problems. And I would emphatically argue against the avoidance of these categories, such as religion, such as esotericism. And there are many reasons for that, but I will single out two. Like first, I do not see it as my job as a historian to correct categories that are there as a historical fact. If there's a Muslim who wants to refer to herself as practicing a religion and sees Islam as a religion, I am not the one who is standing up and saying, oh, actually, you are just parroting an Orientalist. No, like these terms, they have a global history. They are, in fact, globally used. They are not simply a one-way street of Western expansion and diffusionism. They happened, or they were shaped to a large degree in a colonialist context with a lot of power asymmetries, violence, both epistemic and physical, and all these kinds of aspects. But the rest, you know, was not simply passively accepting all of that. And of course, the West needed the other to construct these terms, these concepts to begin with, right? And the second aspect is that I am very strongly opposed to the notion that you find in some varieties of post-colonial perspectives of cultural incommensurability. I always mispronounce this word. And that bears some, like this idea that Western, like religion is a European concept that is incompatible with anything else. It's a corruption of other cultures through colonialism. That bears very concrete dangers. It bears the danger of eclipsing the agency of also colonized people, which is exactly what these kinds of approaches try to avoid, you know, but they do that by claiming all those, apparently those were just parrots repeating Western concepts. And then perhaps even more severely, it bears the danger of cultural essentialism and even chauvinism. If you have, for instance, Hindu proponents who say that Western religion, including Christianity and Islam, under one Western term, Semitic religions, corrupted Indian culture, and our job is now to purify Indian culture from these Western influences, then you have a very, like a concrete outcome of this idea of incommensurability of Western diffusionism and so on. And I think we must avoid that as well.
That's a problem almost in translation studies, if I'm not mistaken. From the 1970s, there was a lot of theories about, you know, everything can be translated into English, but not much. So some words of English can never be translated in another language. And there was a lot of these ideas as well. So yeah,
but I would say, like, I would be part of that camp that would say complete translation is never possible. To some, if you want to take it to very abstract levels, even within one language, it's not completely possible, right? But to put it a bit more simply, like among languages, it's never possible to exactly translate something.
Right.
What you can look at, however, is the context in which a translation happens. Like rather than striving at like the pure essence of the translation metaphysically behind these words, and somehow these authors try to get at it. I don't think it works like that. Oh, sorry.
There's a question by Justin Stein. Thanks for the wonderful papers. I'd like to follow up on the idea that came up in both that terms like esotericism, secrecy, initiation, alternativity, spirituality are discursive strategies to claim superiority to the exoteric, public, mainstream religions. How does this discursive strategy deal with the potential for worldly success in gaining dominance? Do actors have to forego the underdog or alternative status and instead stress a kind of world historical paradigm shift, whether turning off the wheel, coming off Maitreya, Age of Aquarius? Sorry if this is a bit unclear. It's quite late here.
Yes, it's very late. Can you show us the question again? Was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm.
You know what?
You want to tackle that?
I can perhaps try. Sorry.
Should I take this?
No, I can see. It's okay.
Yeah.
So success, right? So how does this discovery style deal with the potential for worldly success in gaining dominance? Well, I mean, alternative doesn't necessarily mean underdog, I think, and I think that's one thing, right?
Yep.
So that alternative just means this idea that okay, I don't like what's happening with this particular thing. I'll bring something else. So it's not really about losing against the mainstream. It's more about how people construct a mainstream all the while they trying to think about an alternative. So for me, I think they're not the same. I guess that would be my quick answer to this. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I would like to refer to Egil Asprim's work in that respect, because sorry, I'm speaking a bit loud, because the like this concept of rejected, rejected knowledge, marginality, the alternative, is extremely context dependent. There can be what has been termed elected marginality in all kinds of ways. People who, for instance, claim to be a part of an elite, like the sheeple don't know that we have swallowed a red pill and we do. And there can be an elected marginality in the sense of, we are against society. We are punkers, we are rockers. We don't want to do what you do. Like we don't care about your norms. That is a decision to be marginal, which is very different from being rejected. And again, like rejected can mean all kinds of different things for all kinds of different reasons that I'm not going to like talk about now so much. I think Egil did a great job in inviting that up.
Hopefully Justin is happy with the answer.
I don't know, Justin, are you happy with the answer?
Okay. Yeah. Any other question? I have a question, but very happy.
Oh, we have two people. Wait a second, let's put this down. So we have two people who have Johan Bohup and Malan. We go, so Malan, can you go first?
Oh yes. Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I thank you for today for very good presentation. Also, the topic I'm here is just not a question, actually, to provide another a perspective how they look at this, how to do the interpretation. Also, the struggle with we do study those historical as a methodology, which is because my study very focused on the Indian tradition. So talking because I do. You see a lot of controversial in terms of methodology and epistemological idea. But as from my understanding, because I study Indian tradition, especially Mahayana tradition in India, So those Indian tradition use the methodology from the very early beginning, use Panini grammatical tradition. They're talking about the Vyakarana until the Vasubandhu use another analogy, use a dialectics analysis, use Vyakayukti, which is a transition. You do see the Mahayana Buddhism, how they use Indian tradition, talking about the logic of the language and goes to the epistemology. Even the Indian tradition, everyone know the Indian tradition learned the epistemology, which is pramana, which is about six of the pramana. So you can understand and how Indian Buddhism in the end from Nalanda tradition makes the 6 prana into only 2, which is perception and inference. They only allow perception and inference to be recognized as a way to understand the knowledge, also wisdom. So we do see there's a transition from how the Mahayana Buddhism interpretation of the all Indian tradition, and it still make the relational between Mahayana Buddhism with the Indian tradition. But unfortunately, East Asian Buddhism doesn't learn Indian logic and epistemology. When even the Chinese intellectual went to India to learn from the Nalanda tradition, like the Xuanzang, he doesn't learn all the package. What is the Nalanda tradition, which is I talking about the Pramana tradition, and also those logic of a language. When he came back, East Asian tradition only used the Chinese logic of the language to understand also esoteric Buddhism. But in Indian tradition, you understand very much use the Indian logic and epistemology. So there's no problem so like the presenter today talking about those esoteric Buddhism in India, it's not understand like the Western understand the religion, which is, it's more about the practical embodiment practice. Even you want to call it Tantrism or Esotericism, but the Indian tradition, especially later on the Mahayana tradition, which is in Nalanda tradition, going to very embodied practice. That's how we do see the Tibetan Buddhism as a lineage of the Nalanda tradition, but not in East Asian tradition. Yes.
Thank you. Was a compliment, right? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're like
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks again, both of you, for very interesting presentations. I think both of you talk about the importance of excavating genealogically relations and also the local representations of what you're talking about. Ioannis, you've done that with spirituality in Japan in many very interesting articles. I haven't read your book yet, but that's a very good, I think, example of how to excavate concepts that are used in different cultural concepts. I also like very much, Julian, your approach to the global religion aspects. I actually just read your introductory chapter on global tantra yesterday. I really think that is the way to proceed onwards, because some of the previous criticism, also post-colonial criticism of how to use religion, for instance, the Eurocentric dissemination theories that I think we definitely have to work with differently. I also see the agency of the non-Westerns. I definitely think this is an important approach. So also seeing the genealogical or the circulations of different cultures or different religions, absolutely important. So the question, of course, is, could you take this, or to which extent would you think it's necessary also to think in terms of analytical concepts usable beyond concrete historical or cultural context? I think I heard you, Julian, talk about the relevance actually of using the concept religion, which I very much support, myself being a historian of religion. But many critics today would say you can't, because it's a colonial, it's a Western, it's a Christian concept, etc. I think even some scholars of Japanese religion would say, well, there was no religion in pre-modern Japan because Shukyo was not there, or meant a totally different thing. That's a very, I think, radical stance to that point. But of course, how would we theoretically or methodological, if we want to, how could we claim that there, for instance, was esotericism in pre-modern India or Japan? Would we be able to say that Mikyo, which is an indigenous term, still used as, well, I think it's a good translation, still calling it esoteric Buddhism. How would we make the combination of saying that this is one pre-modern historical representation of what we could call esoteric religion, or shouldn't we?
Yeah, there are so many possible answers to this, and mine can only be very limited. But the first answer to the charge that it's a Western colonial concept would be, well, it's not anymore. Like if it was at some point, it's not anymore. It has been used by other people. It has been appropriated by other people. As I tried to say before, it emerged. It's like it emerged in exchange, and I don't mean exchange in a romantic way. Exchange includes war and so on, and colonialism. But it emerged in exchange with the other, whatever that constellation is. In the concrete case, it was not simply a Western invention and projection. It was always dependent on something else. It was that something else was in itself also an agent that did things. So no, it's not that easy to say it's a Western invention and projection. We do have to be mindful of the colonial context, but that doesn't mean that we, should just make the logical mistake of repeating another kind of Eurocentrism. Then I would take it another step further, and I would say, okay, so we have established that it's a globally used thing that is not owned by Westerners. How did that happen? So that is the next step. So we look at, okay, so what was designated as religion or esotericism? It's interchangeable in what I'm talking about. How was it used? Like, why was it used? By who was it used? In what context was it used? I did that, or I tried to do that in my last book with the Tantra subject in Bengal, and went back to the 18th century. So you do have to go back in time. You do have to look at, okay, the pre-colonial context. Like what are the debates about Tantra before the British colonialists came up? Like who did the British colonialists work with? Like from whom did they learn the languages? Who did they do their translations? What context of learning were they becoming part of when they entered, for instance, the centers of learning in Bengal, in Nodia? They didn't just make things up. They were dependent on Pandits, for instance, or on Parsis, on Gaitanidis, for instance. And then you can take it from there. And indeed, the genealogical approach would require you to proceed back in time. And that is a super massive challenge. And we are having this discussion, we meaning like this whole global religious history crowd, with people who do raise the objection, well, I want to study 13th century Japan. Like, do I have to start in the 19th century? Of course, no. But you need to have conversations with others who help reflect on how this terminology is used. You have to have conversations, you have to collaborate. And this is how I would proceed in a nutshell. Sorry, this can only be unsatisfying, but it's a super.
I have one more question here in chat. Sure. Okay. So we have a question by Fei Huang. Guénon once made a comparison between Islam and Taoism and suggested that Taoism could be compared to the esoteric aspect of Islam. That is, Taoism is similar in its function to Sufism, while Confucianism is the exoteric side of Chinese religion. My point here is that this understanding doesn't smell of any colonialism or Orientalism, even though his ideas were put forward by a French traditionalist in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think it's a statement more than a question.
I could say something brief. I mean, you could say a lot about this because you're raising some very relevant issues here. And one thing I would want to pick up on is like it doesn't smell of colonialism or Orientalism. And my interpretation of the statement is that it's not derogatory, right? It doesn't talk about like the primitives in contrast to the true religion of Christianity or whatever. Or the superiority of Western civilization, actually quite the contrary. Taoism, Sufism are superior to Western civilization, at least in its modern degenerate form. Like that's the typical traditionalist argument. But of course, this idea is in itself, like it emerged in a colonial context where this idea of religious universalism was very much conditioned by like the notion of this essence of the one universal religion behind different traditions. And already these polemics against modernity, for instance, they point at the complicated context of all of that. And there have been some who were arguing, well, this is kind of Orientalism because there are these massive things, Taoism, Islam just conflated into one perennial tradition. That is an Orientalist projection, but it's positive. So it's like a positive form of Orientalism. And I would say that it's a lot more complicated than that for many reasons. But one reason being that these ideas, you know, like the noble spiritual East, they go hand in hand with notions such as, oh yeah, because they were so static for millennia actually, and they always remained so conservative, they didn't progress, which can mean something different, negative in this colonial perspective, because progress equals a march to modernity, and that's bad. But that idea of Chinese culture being static over millennia and preserving this perennial, pure truth, pristine, primordial truth, that is in itself a very Orientalist idea. And it goes hand in hand with these notions, oh yeah, those are effeminate people, those are static people, those are, and so on. Only that in a traditional perspective, you would turn these arguments around. We have Ioannis safe here in this room, so she could tell you a lot more about the Islam Sufi perspective of that.
So that's anyone else? Do you have anyone in the audience?
So is the term spirituality on the decline? And could we?
Depends who you ask.
Is it? I'm asking you, sir.
For me, if it's in decline,
Yeah. Do you foresee that eventually a new term will take its place?
No, I think what I'm more interested in is about how terms are associated with particular periods of time, which are then kind of, how to say, milestones in a larger version of the evolution of religion, right? So these ideas that the 70s was one of these, and then, you know, and then Om has always been, for many reasonable, I guess, reasons, a kind of a turning point for everything that we talk about about religion in Japan and the spiritual boom. And so I'm more interested in these ideas, and perhaps also the idea that, you know, for example, religion came in Japan in the 19th century or whatever. So it creates, I mean, it's an important argument to make, but at the same time, it creates this very convenient timeline where you can say, but I'm not talking about before stuff, so I can use all the other way around, right? So it creates very convenient kind of periods where you can ignore, and that's why the problem, I think Erika also perfectly talks about this, the problem with creating these booms and you know, and particular periods where there seems to be a shift in things. And so one of them has to do with how it freezes that particular era, if you want, into its own kind of cultural milieu that needs, it is unchangeable. So that everything is explained through that particular term, right? So the occult, if you look at books about the occult boom,
they basically link the occult to everything that has happened in Japan at the time, which may be true to some extent. I don't know, but you know, it's very conveniently linked to that. And Om has, and after what happened to Om, after Om, and this bad image of religion has been linked to everything that has happened in Japan after Om. So I think they're very convenient to explain some things, but not everything. And that also is related to the use of terms like spirituality, right? So spirituality replaced religion because Om. And then you stop thinking about, but okay, so before Om, there wasn't spirituality. And of course, and you look into it, and there is actually, you know, we learned that it's actually transpersonal psychologists that used it for a while in the 80s, and it came in, but it meant something different, and which particularly meant something of what was happening in Berkeley or in the United States, basically. And so there is, you miss all these, the genealogies of words, right? These milestones create. So I'm more interested in that. So I don't know what's going to happen next, but 311 is a very convenient milestone as well, right? It's been used for everything now, right? So religion has come back to the public sphere in Japan, etc., for anything. So I think they're useful, but they create this, let's say, there's a word for it too. They can explain everything that is happening, and I think that's a problem.
And another milestone, maybe next week.
What? Oh, all right. Okay. Well, yeah, you never know. Yes.
Okay, may I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think that, as historically speaking, the complication here is that you see, I think there should be a differentiation there between emic and etic, right? Because it's not, for example, like in the 70s, people were speaking of an occult boom. They were speaking of, you know, it's a media term. This is a cultural term that was present at the time. And it's one thing is to look at that, and another thing is it's for you as a scholar to just take that as fact.
Right, exactly. No, of course, yeah.
So I think that's the thing, that the problem with spirituality.
Yeah, the description and descriptives, I think that's what I was talking, this collapse of, you know, you're talking about a particular phenomenon, and that phenomenon becomes what is happening, and it's, and the occult, I mean, if you think about it, the 1970s have been a milestone for anything, not just occult, right? The new religions, the new age in Japan, the end of secularization, everything has happening in the 1970s, and you know, you start thinking about something as a, you know, like this kind of line where you talk pre and after. But I think that Hansan, what she's trying to do is very important, because she's actually, in a sense, breaking down the occult boom into all in the particular. This is, let's look at this and actually realize how much the 70s were not that just the 70s. It was much more complicated and maybe a bit earlier and things like that. So I think that, but you're right. I mean, there was people talked about it as a cult boom. So I'm not saying there wasn't.
No, with the occult, like, I think it's not that complicated, but with spirituality it is, right? Because you have all these like sociologists of religion. And then you have the actors themselves, like, and that becomes just all mixed up.
But that's also has to do with contemporary stuff, right?
I mean, it is always mixed up.
Yeah,
you know, like this emic-etic distinction is helpful to some extent, because of course there are qualitative differences, but there is no clear boundary between that. They're always codependent. As soon as scholarship is being produced, it is received.
Looping.
Of course, and that also pertains to the issue of what JJ raised about, like, are you creating
exactly.
Of course you are. You know, but the same goes for Western esotericism.
You
know, like, without the field of Western esotericism, nobody would talk about Western esotericism. Like, you know, like that is just how scholarship works. And it's a thing that needs to be reflected, but it also cannot be avoided.
And I think also people are more critical about contemporary things than in the past. I think that's also one.
That's what wanted
Yeah.
to say, I think.
Yeah.
Really, that it's more complicated in the case of your
Yeah.
Okay, do we have maybe one last question? Already 5:30.
There is a comment.
Oh yeah, we have a comment here. Indian Buddhism conception of a poha, explaining the logic and philosophy of language related to medieval thoughts, orthodox, non-orthodox in Indian traditions. I think he's explaining the conception. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for these remarks. It always reminds me of how much I have to learn.
Okay. Do we have maybe a last questions or comments from the audience? The online audience, the physical audience as well, the material and this
Is
material.
there a different?
Something else, we have 15 people left, excluding the 2 EANASE profile. People.
Even Justin is still on board. Are you snoozing already? Oh, there he is. Yeah.
He's going to bed.
sleep. Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sweet dreams.
So, Johan's thanking us for the presentations. Do you guys want to say your final remarks then?
Oh, well, I mean, no, thanks a lot for Julian. It was great to have him here. So,
Well, I
to
wouldn't be
have
here
this
without
discussion.
you,
Yeah. No, it was very interesting. So, thanks for people
Thank you for
Yeah.
everyone who
came.
participated. And yes, dinner time now.
Your
Thank you
time.
so much to everyone. Midday in Denmark. All right. So
Enjoy your
thank
lunch.
you. Closing the Zoom room.
Bye-bye.
Say goodbye to everyone.
Bye.
Want to say goodbye, Hansan, Clinton?
The camera is there. We're going around.
Is it?
It doesn't go
yeah.
all the way. Oh.
All right. Bye bye.